Welcome to Mysterium Simiae, a podcast devoted to documenting encounters, speaking with witnesses and researchers, and exploring the worldwide phenomena of the mysterious ape. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to Mysterium Simiae. I wanted to thank everyone for supporting me on my inaugural podcast. It's been met with great review. I felt it was really a compelling story. Tonight I'm going to read the second of three that I've collected over the last 10 years. This encounter was given to me by one of my best customers, and unfortunately, he passed away 2 years ago, so I'm really grateful that I was able to document this encounter. And what makes this one unique is it's not really long, and it's from a child's point of view, but it happened in the 50s, and I just felt it was so compelling. This man was a professional. He was, no nonsense. Adding to the context of this story. So, this story tonight begins in 1954, as it was told to me. My encounter happened in the year 1954, when I was 9 years old. I was born and raised in Redding, California, and I was the only child to my mother. My father had been killed in the war, and after the news had reached my mother, she took jobs in various parts of California working for the state. Her father owned a small gas station, repair shop, and sundry store in Hornbrook, California, and I was often sent there for summers and holidays so my mother could work without dragging me along or leaving me with sitters or cousins. Hornbrook was a boy's dream, and is located in the northern part of California, not too far from the Oregon border. I remember going into the mountains with my grandfather shooting, fishing, and doing service runs. My grandfather had a 1940s tow truck with a Weaver winch crane on the back and would get frequent calls to help pull a car out of a ditch, pull stumps, or pull cut tree logs. His was the only vehicle around the immediate area that had this capability and was often being requested. I would ride shotgun with him for all his runs, as I was his little sidekick. It was wonderful. One summer morning in June, we were eating breakfast as we did every day at 7. It was early June, and the full force of summer was not yet upon us. Through the window, I saw a sheriff's car come pulling up to my grandfather's house behind the station, and the sheriff walked up to the door. My grandfather obviously knew him as he greeted him with his name and invited him in. The officer sat down and had a cup of coffee and explained that a horse had been hit by a car off one of the smaller roads that head west into the mountains. I cannot remember the name of the road, but there are several that run near and around the Cottonwood Peak area, and it was one of those. He said the horse had fallen down a ravine and needed to be put down, and that my grandfather's tow truck with its winch would be needed to pull the horse into the bush and away from the roads. So up we all got, and I followed my grandfather out to the tow truck. We followed slowly for almost 40 minutes through the winding roads till we got to the area reported. There was no horse to be seen, but a car came by a few minutes after our stopping and reported that the horse was in a small clearing further down the road. It must have climbed up the embankment and made its way down the road. We got into our vehicles and continued down the road around a small ridge, and there, in the distance, I saw a mound of dark brown fur about 100 yards away in a small clearing. As we pulled up, I began to hear my grandfather saying, "Lord Jesus, what is that?" I looked closer, and there was what I assumed to be a bear on top of the felled horse in the small clearing. It was straddling the horse, and its back was to us. We pulled up as close as we could and sat there for a moment. The officer was a little in front of us and got out and motioned to my grandfather, who pulled his .38 out of the glove compartment. I was excited as I could be. My window was open, and I was facing all the action. Our commotion was then noticed by the creature, and it immediately stood up. It stood there looking at us. It was something out of the double feature movies I would see with my cousins. It had matted fur all over its body, arms by its side with big muscles, and a huge disfigured face. My grandfather immediately ran back to the truck and jumped in. I was watching just as the officer fired either a shot at it or in the air. I couldn't tell because my eyes were locked on it. I looked at my grandfather, who was reaching for something in the back seat. Maybe it was a rifle. I never saw, because my attention was immediately drawn right back to this creature. The creature then turned and grabbed the horse by its neck and began dragging it. He got a few feet, but the dead weight was too much, and he just let it go, began a small amble, and then broke into a steady run into the near forest. And like that, he was gone. We all sat for a minute, and my grandfather got out to talk to the officer. I sat and scanned as hard as I could try, just to see if I could see the creature anywhere in the ridgeline. My grandfather and the officer slowly crept out to the clearing and inspected the horse, all the while nervously looking around. After a few minutes, they came back and finished up talking. I could hear this time a little conversation and heard the officer saying that whatever it was had not been seen in a few years. It was obviously not a stranger to these parts anyway. My grandfather got in the truck and quietly turned around, and as we headed back to Hornbrook, I asked my grandfather, "What was that?" He just looked at me and said he wasn't sure. Probably a bear that was sick. I said that it looked like the monster from the scary movies. He just replied, "I don't think that's what it was." When we returned home, my grandfather talked deep into the night with my grandmother and her brother. They kept conversation low and would stop if I walked into the kitchen for something. As the days went by, things returned to normal, and I never thought about what I saw again until 1968. I was stationed in Thailand with the Air Force when the Patterson-Gimlin film came out. It was almost identical to the creature I saw, except the Patterson Bigfoot had short hair. The way it ambled away was just like the creature I saw before it started running. I watched it with interest and confided with my crew that I had seen one also when I was a kid. In those days, you could say such things without much worry. I was met with questions, and I recounted the story, and that's about where it ended. I tried a couple of times to remember the area, and even drove up years later to look. So much had changed since the 50s. It was near impossible. But I know what I saw, and it always served as an interesting footnote in my life. So wow, what a wonderful encounter. This particular encounter resonated with me because it was from the perspective of a child. And you know, as kids we're taught that monsters don't exist. And this encounter is the actual opposite of what we're taught. And it just really was interesting. And I was really happy to be able to relay it to you tonight. I have one more from the 3 encounter stories that I have. And then after that, I'm going to be inviting Clinton Granberry to be a guest. He has his own podcast called OK Talk. He's a wonderful person. Absolutely just what the Bigfoot community needs. And if you haven't checked out his podcast, it's called OK Talk. And he'll be discussing the topic of the Bigfoot phenomena. And I'm going to bring up with him a very controversial idea that I have, No one has thought of this, and I'm going to keep it secret for now. I'm going to not say what it is, but I feel like it would be a surefire way to capture evidence, almost foolproof. I majored in anthropology in college, and my knowledge of primates, we tend to have certain habits and traits that we share. And I have an idea that I think would absolutely enable us to capture at least video or photographic evidence. I'll be talking with him about that. You're not going to want to miss that. It's going to be controversial, and I'm expecting some possibly negative feedback, but stay tuned for that. I would like to also say that it seems the trend for podcasts are to have free episodes and then have a pay site, and I don't really want to do that. I'm going to keep the show free, but what I do have is a Patreon account, and I would be more than grateful if you would contribute to that. If you go to the Patreon link, will be with podcast episodes. Click on that, make a contribution that will help grow this podcast. Equipment, everything, time.